A mess line in the Norman rain. Mud to the ankles, mess tins clattering, the smell of boiled coffee and wet wool. Hundreds of tired men in olive drab shuffle forward one boot at a time toward a steaming kettle, and somewhere in the middle of that grey column stands a man in a plain field jacket with no insignia, no stars, nothing on his shoulders to tell you he commands the largest force of soldiers any American had ever led into battle. A young officer recognizes him and tries to wave him forward, to move him to the front where a general belongs. The man in the plain jacket refuses. He will wait his turn like everyone else. He will not cut the line. It is a small thing, a footnote, the kind of detail that biographers fold into a single warm sentence and move past. But every single man standing in that line is also a number. And before the summer ends, this same quiet officer, who will not step ahead of a private for a cup of coffee, will be forced, entirely alone, to decide how many of those numbers can be spent. The line he refuses to break and the ledger he must balance are made of exactly the same men. He thought of himself as an ordinary man who happened to wear extra stars. That sentence sounds like false modesty until you sit with the arithmetic of his command. By the summer of 1944, Omar Bradley held the 1st United States Army on the beaches of Normandy, and inside it lived hundreds of thousands of lives. Each of them belonged to a mother in Ohio or a wife in Texas or a kid brother who still wrote letters. And Bradley felt the weight of every one of them in a way that gnawed at him, because he could never quite stop seeing the faces behind the casualty tallies that landed on his desk each morning. The correspondent, Ernie Pyle, who lived among the infantry and trusted almost no one with stars on their collar, looked at this spectacled, soft-voiced figure and decided he was different. Pyle called him the general of the ordinary soldier, the one who spoke their language and grieved their losses. The nickname stuck because it was true. Bradley dressed plainly on purpose. He ate what they ate. He stood where they stood. We often look back at men of high command and admire their distance, their cold clarity, the way they can move divisions on a map like chess pieces and feel nothing. But the cold reality of Bradley was the opposite, and it raises a question that historians still circle warily. When a man holds hundreds of thousands of lives in his hands, is a deep and aching empathy a form of clarity that keeps him honest? Or is it a weight that slows the hand at the exact instant a colder man would strike? Bradley would spend the entire Norman summer proving that the answer is not simple, because the ground itself had turned against him. Behind those beaches lay the Bocage. For 1,000 years, Norman farmers had fenced their tiny fields with earthen banks crowned by tangled hedgerows, walls of root and thorn taller than a man, packed so dense that a tank could not see over them or punch through them without rearing its belly to the sky and dying there. Every field became a fortress. Every gap became a kill zone for a hidden machine gun. The German defenders had studied this terrain for years, and they made the Americans pay for each hedgerow in the only currency that mattered to Bradley, the one he could not stop counting. The advance crawled. Some units measured a full day's fighting in a few hundred yards of ruined orchard. Men learned to fear the open gateways between fields more than open ground, because the enemy had every gate ranged in advance. A soldier writing home from those weeks described the hedges pressing in until the war shrank to a single suffocating square of dirt, and you could not remember there was a horizon anywhere in the world. The optimism of the landings drained away into the mud, replaced by a slow, grinding sense that this might never end. Bradley sat in his command post with the maps and the daily numbers, and he understood something his superiors back in England were slower to grasp. You could not win this by feeding more men into the hedges one field at a time. That math only ran in one direction, and it ran toward a bill he could never pay. The casualties were climbing, the ground was barely moving, and the whole Allied enterprise risked grinding to a halt within sight of the sea it had just crossed. So he began to assemble a gamble, a way to stop trading lives for hedgerows, and instead tear a single violent hole in the German line, then pour an entire army through it before the enemy could close the wound. It would demand a concentration of force so dense and an opening blow so total that it carried its own terrible risk. To break the deadlock, Bradley would have to spend lives deliberately in a great lump sum in the hope of saving more lives in the long run. The man who would not cut the mess line was about to sit down with the ledger and start signing. His plan had a name. He called it Cobra. A rifleman from the 29th Division, scribbling by candle in a captured German dugout, recorded that the dirt walls seemed to breathe, that you crawled toward a gap, and the whole green wall opposite simply opened up at you with a sound he could only call the tearing of canvas. That was the German light machine gun, the one the Americans had learned to dread, firing so fast its bursts ran together into a single ripping note. Whole squads went to ground in a single field and did not rise. The Americans improvised because they had to. Sergeants welded steel prongs cut from the German beach obstacles onto the front of their Sherman tanks, so that, instead of climbing the earthen banks and exposing their thin underarmor, the tanks could root straight through the hedge like a boar through brush. The idea came from a young cavalryman named Curtis Cullen, and it spread through the Bocage in days. It was a small, brilliant fix. It was also an admission of how badly the terrain had broken the original plan. Men measured time in the distance between hedgerows. A soldier wrote that he had stopped thinking about Paris or Berlin or the end of anything, that his entire ambition had shrunk to reaching the far bank of the next field and finding it empty. The horizon, he said, had been amputated. There was only the green wall ahead and the green wall behind, and the narrowing space of churned dirt where men waited to find out which gateway had been ranged by the guns. This was the first turn of the screw. The deadlock was not a battle Bradley was losing. It was a battle that refused to be a battle at all, a slow subtraction with no decisive moment to seize. Bradley's superior, the British field commander Bernard Montgomery, had drawn the German armoured strength onto the British and Canadian shoulder of the front around the city of Caen, a grinding magnet of a fight that chewed through Commonwealth tank regiments at a frightening rate. The arrangement was sound in theory. It pinned the heaviest German divisions in the east so that Bradley, in the west, might find softer ground to break through. But the cost in the east was enormous. The progress was glacial, and the alliance strained under the weight of mounting tallies and competing reputations. George Patton was waiting in the wings, his Third Army not yet activated, his presence a kind of caged electricity at the edge of Bradley's headquarters. The arithmetic of rank had inverted their old relationship. In the desert and in Sicily, Patton had been the senior man and Bradley his subordinate. Now Bradley held the higher command, and Patton, the more famous and more flamboyant soldier, chafed under it. Bradley did not trust Patton's impulses. He found him reckless, theatrical, dangerously in love with speed for its own sake. Patton, in turn, privately judged Bradley too cautious, too bound to the ledger. Here lies one of the quiet ironies that modern historians keep returning to. The two men were temperamental opposites, and the campaign would need both of them. Bradley's caution would build the breakthrough with surgical care. Patton's recklessness would exploit it with a speed that left the enemy reeling. Neither man, alone, could have produced the result. And yet each privately believed the other's defining quality was a flaw. We tend to imagine great campaigns as the product of a single guiding mind. The truth in Normandy was messier and more human, a breakthrough engineered by a man who distrusted the very recklessness that would make his plan pay off. Bradley refined his gamble. He would mass his bombers and concentrate them on a narrow rectangle of German front southwest of Saint-Lô, a corridor only a few thousand yards wide, and he would saturate it so completely that whatever survived would be too stunned to resist the ground assault that followed within minutes. He flew to England to argue the details with the airmen. He wanted the bombers to fly parallel to the front line, along its length, so that any bomb falling short would land on open ground rather than on his own waiting infantry. The airmen resisted. A parallel approach over that narrow corridor would funnel hundreds of heavy aircraft through a thin lane of sky, slow and predictable for the German anti-aircraft gunners, and it would take far longer to deliver the weight of explosive he wanted. They preferred to fly perpendicular, straight in over the heads of his own men. It was a disagreement about geometry. It would become a tragedy about it. On the 24th of July, 1944, the first attempt went wrong before it began. Cloud closed over the corridor, the mission was recalled in mid-flight, and some crews who never received the recall released their loads through the murk. Some of that weight came down on the wrong side of the line, among the men who were supposed to be the spear, not the target. The ground assault stuttered and stalled, and the Germans, now alerted, braced for what was plainly coming. Bradley was anguished, and he was trapped. The secret was out. To call it off entirely would waste the one great concentration of force he had assembled and hand the enemy time to reinforce. He let it go forward again the next day. On the 25th of July, the sky filled with the largest concentration of bombers ever flung at a single tactical target. Wave after wave of heavy aircraft, more than 1,500 of them, with medium bombers and fighter bombers stacked behind, ground over the corridor and emptied themselves onto that narrow rectangle of France. The earth in the target zone ceased to be earth. A German tank commander who lived through it wrote afterward that the ground itself had become liquid, that whole armored vehicles were flipped onto their backs like beetles, that crews who survived wandered out, unable to speak or hear, their minds simply gone for hours. An entire German division was, in the space of an hour, hammered into a smoking ruin that could no longer function as a fighting force. But the geometry betrayed them again. A smoke and dust marker drifted backward over the American lines. Some bomb loads, released into that creeping haze, came down on the men, waiting to attack. Steel fell from the sky onto the soldiers it was meant to protect. More than 100 Americans were lost in that single grey rain of error, and among them was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the man who had built and trained the entire American ground army, who had come forward to watch the assault and was caught in the open. He became the highest-ranking American soldier lost in the European fighting, taken not by the enemy, but by the weapon of his own side. This is the second, and the cruelest, turn of the screw, and it forces a haunting question onto everyone who studies command. Bradley had argued for the safer geometry, the parallel approach. He had been overruled. The men came down through the dust because of a decision he had fought against and lost. And yet the assault could not be stopped. The breakthrough had to be bought, and the price was paid in the lives of his own. There is no clean moral arithmetic that balances this. A more reckless man might have spent those lives without a second thought. Bradley spent them with full awareness of the cost, having tried and failed to lower it, and then had to keep going as though the loss could be absorbed. The empathy that made men love him did not spare him this. It only made him feel it more. He kept going. He had no other choice. And then, suddenly, the math reversed. The German front, pounded into a daze and bled white at exactly the point Bradley had chosen, simply came apart. The hole he had spent so much to tear opened wider than even he had dared hope. American columns that had measured progress in hundreds of yards for 7 weeks now measured it in miles within a day. The hedgerow prison gave way to open road. The deadlock that had no decisive moment had finally found one. This was the instant Patton's recklessness became a virtue. Released into the breach, the Third Army poured south and then wheeled east in a sweep so fast that German command could not track it. The caged electricity was loose, and Bradley, the cautious engineer, watched his careful breakthrough turn into the wild exploitation he could never have run himself. The German dictator's response was the third turn of the screw, and it nearly undid everything. Rather than pull his forces back from the widening gap, the German leader ordered the opposite. He commanded his armored divisions to drive west, straight toward the town of Mortain and the sea beyond, to sever the narrow neck through which the entire American breakout was now flowing. If the armor reached the coast, it would cut Patton's racing columns off from their supply and trap them in the open. It was a desperate stroke, and for a few hours on the night of the 6th of August, it had a terrible momentum. German armor rolled forward in the dark and overran forward positions. But a battalion of American infantry held a bare hill above Mortain, surrounded, out of contact, low on everything. From that hill, men with radios could see the whole German thrust laid out below them, and they called fire down onto it through days of being cut off, eating nothing, running their batteries to nothing, refusing to come off the high ground. A soldier on that hill described the strangeness of watching an entire enemy offensive crawl beneath his position while he could do nothing but whisper coordinates into a dying radio and pray the shells arrived. By day, fighter bombers found the German armor exposed on open roads and broke its back from the air. The thrust toward the sea stalled, then died, in the fields short of its goal. And here Bradley saw something the German command had not. By driving his armor west into the narrow neck, the German leader had pushed his strongest forces deeper into a sack whose mouth was still open behind them, far to the east. The harder they pushed for the coast, the further they reached into a trap that had not yet been built, but that Bradley could suddenly see in his mind, complete and waiting. The breakout had survived its gravest hour. Now Bradley looked east, at the open mouth of the sack, and began to do the arithmetic of closing it. The ledger was about to demand its largest entry yet. By the middle of August, the trap had built itself. The German armies that had driven west toward Mortain were now caught in a long, narrowing pocket of Norman countryside, hemmed by Allied forces closing from 3 sides. To the north, the British and Canadians pressed down toward the town of Falaise. To the south, Patton's racing columns had swung up through Argentan. Between those two jaws lay a gap of barely 20 miles, and through that gap an entire German army group, the bulk of the enemy strength in the west, was now trying to escape eastward before the mouth of the sack snapped shut. Close that gap, and the war in the west might effectively end in a single August week. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers and the heart of their armored strength would be sealed inside, unable to fight again. It was the kind of decisive moment that had refused to exist for the entire Bocage summer, the one clean stroke that could redeem every yard of mud. On the 12th of August, Patton's lead elements reached the edge of Argentan. The southern jaw was within reach of slamming north to meet the Canadians coming down. Patton, electric, certain, telephoned Bradley's headquarters and asked for permission to keep driving north, to close the gap himself with American troops. The famous line attributed to him in the retelling has him offering to drive the British into the sea. Whether or not he said it exactly so, the meaning was unmistakable. He wanted to slam the door, and he wanted to do it now. And for a few hours on the 13th of August, in a command post far from the dust of Argentan, the cautious engineer held the fate of an entire German army group in his hands, and he did the arithmetic. He saw the rewards. No one understood better than he did what closing that gap would mean. But he also saw the danger, and the danger was the danger that had governed his whole career. If Patton's Americans drove hard north toward the Canadians driving hard south, the two Allied forces would converge head-on in the same narrow corridor, in the chaos of a collapsing pocket, with thousands of armed and desperate Germans surging between them. In the confusion, in the dust, with units intermingling at speed, Americans might fire on Canadians and Canadians on Americans. The boundary line between the two armies had been agreed at a point south of Falaise. To send Patton across it, into ground assigned to another command, risked a catastrophe of friendly fire on a scale that haunted him after what the bombs had done at Cobra. There was a second fear in the ledger. The German forces still inside the pocket were not a beaten rabble. They were a cornered army, and a cornered army striking outward at a thin American blocking line might shatter it. Bradley later put it in cold terms. He preferred, he said, a solid shoulder at Argentan to the risk of a broken neck at Falaise. He would rather hold a firm line that could not be broken than throw a weak one across the enemy's escape and watch it be torn open. So he made his choice. He ordered Patton to halt at Argentan. He would not send the southern jaw across the boundary line. He would hold his shoulder firm and wait for the Canadians to close the distance from the north. The man who would not step ahead of a private in a mess queue, who insisted he was no different from any soldier in that grey column, now stood at the single moment in the entire campaign that most demanded he break the rules, override the boundary, seize the reward, whatever the risk. And he did what he had always done. He respected the line. He stayed on his own side of it. He chose the solid shoulder, the careful ledger, the avoidance of a catastrophe he could vividly imagine, over the gamble on a triumph he could only hope for. Here, the seed planted in the Norman rain comes fully to flower, and its irony is almost unbearable. The very quality that made Omar Bradley beloved, the humility that would not let him cut ahead of his own men, the refusal to place himself above the boundaries that governed everyone else, was the same quality that now stayed his hand at the decisive instant. The empathy and the caution were not two traits, they were one trait, wearing two faces. The man who could not bear to spend lives carelessly could also not bring himself to gamble them on the wild closing stroke that a colder, more reckless commander would have taken without hesitation. And this is where the haunting question sharpens to a point. We praise Bradley's restraint at Cobra, where his caution was wisdom. We must then ask honestly whether the same restraint at Argentan was wisdom too, or whether it was the moment when a great virtue became, for a few critical days, a great cost. The trait that saved lives in the hedgerows may have prolonged the war that would take far more of them. History rarely lets a man keep his virtues clean. The Canadians, grinding against fierce resistance in the north, did not close the distance quickly. The British commander, Montgomery, who held authority over the boundary, did not order the Americans across it either. Up north, the door swung shut slowly, hinge by stubborn hinge, while Bradley's southern jaw sat firm and still at Argentan, exactly where he had planted it. And through the gap that no one closed in time, the German army began to pour eastward into the dark. The trucks and the marching columns and the surviving armor streamed through the narrowing neck, hour after hour, under constant air attack. but never fully sealed. Every hour the gap stayed open was an hour in which men who would fight again at the German border, in the winter forests, in the final desperate battles of the next year, walked free out of the sack that had nearly become their tomb. Bradley had held his line, the line had held, and the enemy escaped through the space beside it. The gap finally closed on the 21st of August, 1944. By then, it was too late to be everything it might have been. The pocket was sealed, and what remained inside was a ruin. The roads through the neck had become a corridor of abandoned and broken machines, the wreckage of an army that had been pounded from the air for days as it fled. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were taken inside the sack, and the loss in equipment was staggering. By any ordinary measure, it was a crushing Allied victory, and Bradley was right to count it as one. But the men who mattered most had already walked out the open side. Before the door swung shut, a large part of the German command structure and many thousands of veteran soldiers had escaped eastward, across the river, and into the night. They were the seed of the armies that would stiffen at the German frontier that autumn, that would hold the winter forests through months of misery, that would mass for one last violent surprise in the snow before the year was out. The war in the West, which might have been broken open in a single August week, would instead grind on for 9 more months and cost a sum that no ledger in any command post could hold. We often look back at Falaise and reach for a single villain to blame for the open gap, and the choices are tangled enough that the argument has never ended. But the cold reality is that no one man closed it, and no one man left it open. The boundary line, the slow northern grind, the fear of a head-on collision, the caution of more than one commander, all of it braided together into those few fatal days. And at the center of the braid stood Bradley, the man who would not cross the line, doing exactly what his entire nature had always told him to do. This is the final question, and it does not resolve. The humility that made the soldiers love him and the caution that may have let the enemy escape were never separate things. They were the same man. You cannot keep the general who waited his turn in the mess line and discard the general who would not slam the door at Argentan, because they are one figure, governed by one unbroken principle, that he had no right to place his own judgment above the lines that bound everyone. In the mud of the queue, that principle was grace. In the dust of the pocket, it may have been a price. So, return, at the last, to that grey column in the Norman rain. The man in the plain jacket with no stars on his shoulders, refusing to step ahead of a single private, insisting he was no different from any of them. Every man in that line was a number he could not stop counting, and that was his glory. But the same refusal to step out of line, to set himself above the rules, to seize by force what waited just across a boundary, that was the thing that stayed his hand when history pressed the decisive stroke into his palm and asked him to break a rule to end a war. He waited his turn. He held his line. He balanced his ledger to the last careful figure. And through the space beside the line he would not cross, an army walked free into the dark, to be paid for, in full, in another winter.